the 1987 announcements made by Democratic candidates for president. You'll hear next from former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt, who announced his candidacy in March of last year in Manchester, New Hampshire.
Well, I know there's a lot of suspense here this morning. I must tell you that I am ready to jump into the water, and with the help of all of you, we're going to make a lot of waves. And I just want to thank you all very, very much for being here this morning. Leo, I appreciate the introduction, and I very much appreciate your support. It scarcely seems possible that it was only 6, 8, 9 months ago that I came to New Hampshire a stranger, to begin knocking on doors, to begin meeting many of you here in this room one at a time. It's a process that's been wonderfully encouraging, during which I have learned a great deal from all of you, and of course, that finally brings me here today to end the suspense. Now, what I'd like to do this morning, just briefly, is talk about what I think this campaign is all about, because it's an important exercise. It's an exercise that our democracy affords us once every 4 years. It's a season of national reckoning. It's a time to take stock, to ask where we are, where we've been, and where it is that we're going. It's a time to ask what we as Americans want to make of our country. Now, my own answer has a lot to do with this learning center that we're in today, because the future of this country is very much tied up with the success of our children in learning about science, in mastering the fundamentals, in learning to be competitive in order to enable the most competitive and vigorous economy in the history of the world. And it's building that economy which must be the first goal of the next president. That goal is what brings me here today to embark upon the most challenging journey in American public life. Now, I begin where we all begin, in the small town that I grew up in, with the values that I learned there, and the people and the places that I've known along the way. My roots are in the canyon country of northern Arizona. It's a land that was staked out by my grandparents when they pushed west from Ohio 100 years ago. I come from a family of ranchers and frontier merchants. They helped in their day to build schools and towns in the wilderness. And they lived by a few simple beliefs. You work hard, you do what's right, and you stand up for what you believe in. Now, that's what I take from my state of Arizona. Back in the 60s, I took those values down south. I took them to Selma, Alabama in the fight for civil rights, and then on from Mississippi to Texas in the war on poverty. And during those years, I learned that individual Americans really can make a difference, and that each one of us has an obligation to do what we can to transform the society that we lived in. In the 70s and the 80s, I took those values back to Arizona, back to my home state, first as prosecutor and then as governor. And I learned again, once again, that the hard things in life are usually the things that are worth fighting for, like getting a liberal health care bill out of the most conservative legislature in the country, like taking on organized crime and prosecuting criminals who had a contract on my life, like intervening in labor disputes, trying to settle them, but calling out the National Guard when it was necessary to keep the peace. The America that we all grew up with was an America in charge. It was confident of its purpose, proud of its history, and certain of its future. It was an America that was proud and solid and real. It was an America of men and women who knew they could do anything that they set their minds on doing. Today, sometimes it seems that we have leaders who don't set their minds on much of anything. We have a government by teleprompter in which words and deeds seem to have lost all logical connection. For years, we've heard fine words about balancing the budget from a president who has never submitted a budget to the Congress within $100 billion of balance. That's not leadership. And for years, we've heard courageous words about terrorists from a president who sends them missiles for ransom. And then he pleads amnesia when he's called to account. That's not courage. For years, we've heard patriotic words from an administration that compares the Contras to our founding fathers and then solicits sultans and Saudis and Swiss bankers to fund them behind our backs. It's a mockery of patriotism. An America in charge again is going to have leadership in the cockpit with its hands on the stick. Leadership that says what it means, that does what it says, and that holds itself accountable for the consequences. I submit that the next President of the United States must dare to be different, must be willing to cast aside the tired orthodoxies that hold back our leaders. The next president must chart a course that lets America take charge of its future. He must say and do what other politicians dare not even think. He must risk offending some potential supporters. He must risk breaching the etiquette of Washington. He must lead. The next president must show us the different ways to achieve an explosion of American productivity. He must do so even when change is not embraced by each and every interest group, because that's the only way to put America in charge of its economy, in charge of our future again. Out in Arizona, we worked an economic miracle during the decade that I was governor. We created more new jobs and more new investment than any other state in the Union. That's what all America used to be like: dynamic, resilient, the wonder of the world. Yet today, our productivity is growing at a half the rate of Germany, a third the rate of France, a fourth the rate of Japan. Real family income, the bottom line value of our paychecks, it's not growing at all. And on America's farms, the thing that's growing fastest is the suffering of families crushed between debt and declining land values. For the last 6 years in this country, we haven't been standing tall. We've been standing still. I want to see an America in charge of its own economic future. And I submit that's going to take nothing less than a transformation of our economy. Now you may ask, where would I start? Well, I'd start where the economy starts. I'd start with the backbone of our economic strength, the individual American worker. After 6 years of trickle down, it's time to build an economy that starts from the bottom up. And a bottom-up economy is an economy, I believe, that must share its gains and losses among all of the people who help create them. What it means is rewarding productivity. And I'd say to every single American worker. If you make first-rate efforts, if you pay attention to detail, if you improve the quality of your product, if you show us better ways to do business, if you make really first-rate efforts, you ought to have first-rate rewards. And that's not what we're saying today. How many times have you heard, as I've heard, of executives who walk down onto the shop floor and say, in order to compete, you have to take a 20 or 30% wage cut. Then they leave the shop floor and they go up to the executive boardroom and say, we've solved the problem, and now it's time to get a bonus for having solved it. Well, that's equivalent to saying that America's workers are mindless commodities. They're simply expendable products that can be treated that way. They can't, because so long as American labor and management only see themselves as adversaries, so long as they fail to understand that we must pull together in this society and that the management can't succeed without a change in what happens on the shop floor, we're never going to return to our rightful place as the strongest and most dynamic economy in the world. And I say to you, the next president of the United States must go to the very heart of this problem. We're going to have to change the patterns of 100 years. And I think we're going to have to set some different national goals. That by 1996, after 8 years of the next administration, a Democratic administration, the American workplace will reflect the common pursuit of labor and management, the pursuit of competitive success. That by 1996, 2/3 of American workers will share directly in the profits and losses of the businesses that they work in. That they'll earn new forms of compensation that give them a greater stake in the products they produce and the companies they work for. In other words, what I'm saying is that we must set a goal that by 1996, we will have signaled the end of trickle-down economics and the arrival of a gain-sharing economy in which everybody has a stake, in which the power and success and productivity is built from the bottom all the way up. Now, I'd like to give you just a couple of examples of what it is I mean by that strong language. I think that in order to get this change underway, the next president ought to say that no American company will be permitted to deduct an executive bonus as a business expense unless it offers productivity pay to every single employee in that enterprise. Why? Because productivity is a shared effort, and it has to have shared rewards. And if you perform well, and if you earn a bonus for that performance, you ought to have the right to deposit that bonus in a tax-exempt account. When American workers have a greater stake in the wealth that we all create, and when the American president has greater courage to stand up for our national economic interests, then the next thing we'll have to do is to step out there and take charge of our trade deficit. Now, I have no doubt that American workers can outproduce and outcompete any nation on earth. We have the longest tradition, the best minds, the most skilled workforce in the world. The American inventions that are exhibited right here in this traditional old industrial site are examples of the ingenuity, the Yankee ingenuity that helped build this nation, and that's going to have to be recaptured in order to spawn the innovations and the industries of the next century. But the next president has to give those industries a chance to turn loose the power of the American spirit, to compete in a world economy that rewards productivity, not predators. Now, 40 years ago, at a place in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, American leadership laid down the trading laws of nations. But the problem is that the world's changed since then. We don't live in the world of Bretton Woods. The world has been revolutionized. The trading laws are obsolete, and it's time for a brand new agreement. We've got to tear that obsolete structure down and rebuild it from the ground up. Now you may say, am I talking about protectionism? No, I'm not talking about protectionism. And I'm not talking about the spitting and the bickering that goes on with the Europeans, the United States of America, the leader of the free world, reduced to quarreling about the price of wine and cheese. We can't get at our trade problems by quarreling about peripheral things like that. Our whole trading position is under assault. And our leaders of the United States of America are quarreling about hors d'oeuvres. The next president of the United States has to step up to the reality. As a first priority, he's got to call the leaders of the industrial countries together and sit them down in one place and say, those agreements are obsolete. It's time to rewrite the rules that govern international trade. And to say to those leaders what we need and what we need now is a new and simple agreement for the 1980s and the 90s, an agreement for balanced trade. It says simply this: if you export, you import, and you do it in roughly equal measure. The overall value of what you sell to the world must match the value of what you buy. Is that protectionist? No, it's common sense. It says we can expand the trading order by writing rules of equity in which everybody benefits. And if that's not the case, and if you won't balance your accounts, then your victims will balance them for you with across-the-board tariffs that increase until the system is back in balance. Now, this concept of balance is no less important in our own domestic budget, because the White House has run up, listen to this, not only the first, but the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth largest annual budget deficits in the history of the United States of America. It's unbelievable. Now, as governor of Arizona, I balanced 9 budgets in a row. And our next president must aim to match that. But we, of course, have to be honest about how we go about it. Our leaders in Washington have spent so recklessly that it'll take time to repair the damage. But we must begin, and there's just one way to begin making those repairs: by making choices, by setting priorities, by deciding that some things really are more important than others. And I say simply, if you don't set priorities and if you can't make choices and you won't stand by them, you don't belong in government, and you ought to get out. Now, being serious about choices means being honest and direct about both the additions and the subtractions in the federal budget. And through the course of this campaign, I mean to hold myself to that standard of honesty and directness and specificity. And I'm going to challenge every other presidential candidate to speak up to the American people in exactly the same way. Because government can't do everything for everybody. Do we really need to give interest deductions to mansions and second vacation homes? Is that the purpose of a law which was intended to help people form families and buy their first home? Do we really need to pay subsidies to corporate mega farms? That law was intended to help family farmers. Why is it that it's turned into a program spewing out mega million-dollar checks to agribusinesses all over this country? That's not what it was intended to do. And do we really need to go to Washington and ask to subsidize grants or projects that no mayor or governor would ever ask his citizens to pay for? Is that the purpose of the federal government? Do we really need 3 new generations of missiles all at once? Do the Vanderbilts and the Mellons really need exactly the same tax-exempt Social Security benefits as a widow living in a cold water flat? I say we don't need those things, and we don't need to do business like that. An America in charge of its budget would put the money where it really matters. Now, you may ask, where does it really matter? What are my priorities? First, children. In the greatest nation on earth, 1 in 4 children now lives in poverty, literally below the poverty line. They go hungry. They don't have doctors. We have to put an end to that. What kind of economic future can we expect if children are too hungry to learn and too sick to dream? And what kind of a society have we become if we fail to extend them a hand? Now, we've got to get at the root causes. We must come together as commonsensical Americans to stop this downward spiral of children having children. And we must rejuvenate the old and honorable value of individuals taking responsibility for themselves. But we must also address the immediate crisis. Every child in poverty should be eligible for Medicaid. And believe it or not, right now 8 million aren't. Will it cost money to include them? Sure it will. Of course it will. And I'm here to tell you that it's our moral obligation to do it now. Another priority is education. We need a new emphasis on performance, on measurable progress by our children. And there's no doubt about it, that will cost money as well. Let me tell you what I'd do. I'd go to every state house and I'd make the following offer to every governor. I'd say, it's time for the federal government to pick up the entire cost of Medicaid, and we'll do it on the condition that you as governor devote the entire savings to the public school system in your state. Teachers' salaries, special education, the programs that count. What about child care? We see more and more families in this country with 2 parents working, often because they must in order to maintain the income that used to be provided by wage earners. I believe that we have an obligation in this country to make a statement to parents who are among the working poor, parents who are headed into the workplace to support their children, parents who have the gumption and the ability and the drive to say, I'm going to get off welfare. I'm going to go out and take responsibility for my lives. The very least we can do for those parents is to say, we're going to help you. We're going to help you as you move into the workplace. And what I say is simply that every parent who works should have a reasonable choice of child care. And every family that needs it should have a voucher to help make that care affordable. Then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of environment are we in this country leaving for our children? 1 in 5 American households now drinks water laced with lead. I'm tired of hearing about unscrupulous people who dump toxic waste and get away with it. And I'm even more tired about hearing the ones who get caught and then have their wrists slapped. It's time we told every polluter, if you poison our water, you're going to jail. And we're going to use your money to clean it up. When we look overseas, beyond our shores, an America in charge would take advantage of the new realities of the 1990s. For the first time in history, the civilizations of East and West are coming together across the Pacific Ocean. And it's America that stands at the crossroads. While Marxist economies around this world are stagnating and declining, market economies, it's the market economies that are expanding and proliferating and blossoming. Democracy is on the march from all over the Orient to the tip of South America. Now, there are those in this land who are fearful, who find a cloud around every silver lining, who detect advances by our enemies at every step. But I must tell you, they're refusing to take yes for an answer, because it's time to look outward with confidence as the rest of the world looks toward us for leadership. An America in charge would stamp out terrorism. And we must begin with a pledge to let our heads rule our hearts. We must never again trade anything of value for a hostage. And if we take that pledge seriously, we must realize that some of the hostages may not be coming home. Now, we can't prevent every single terrorist outrage, but we can deter terrorism, and we can punish them. If a nation is killing Americans and holding Americans against their will, then that nation must be forced to pay a price. As for the Soviet Union, it remains a powerful and dangerous adversary. The values of their leaders have very little in common with the values of ours. But we also must come to realize that the terms of our competition, a battle for the loyalty of large groups of people all over this planet, is turning distinctly to our advantage, because we must be secure enough in our strength to come to mutual agreements. We undeniably share an interest, and not only an interest, a duty to prevent nuclear war. The vital task of our next president will be to bring the Soviets to the bargaining table and to keep them there until we have an agreement. We need a comprehensive test ban, because if you can't test a new weapon, you never get to deploy it. We need a 50% cut in offensive weapons, because it's long past time for a treaty which reduces nuclear weapons instead of simply ratifying the increases. And we need a mutual moratorium on Star Wars, because you don't stop one arms race by starting another. America does not have to leave arms merchants in charge of our security, terrorists in charge of our diplomacy and security, soldiers of fortune in charge of our Central American desk, Japanese merchants in charge of our trading, bigots in charge of our social agenda, embezzlers in charge of Wall Street, political pollsters in charge of our politics, and amateurs in charge of the White House. I want to see I want to see an America in charge again. And all that takes is leadership. Leadership that speaks plainly and specifically about what it is it intends to do. Leadership that molds our government with one central objective: to create an outburst of productivity that once again restores America as the greatest and most dynamic economy in the world. Leadership that gives all American workers a stake in the success of their businesses, and leadership that brings our toppling trade posture into balance. Leadership that is bold and different, without fear of being unconventional and unorthodox. An America in charge again. It's the cause of a lifetime. And that's why I'm here. And that's why I offer myself today as a candidate for President of the United States.
Up next, we continue our look back at the 1987 announcements made by Democratic candidates